Okay, so to start, we're going to be covering the Kalam cosmological argument this week, and we'll get to it further when I start talking about evidences, because some of it might be, I know, is kind of controversial for some Christians. So, for example, like the Big Bang and stuff, and so I'm going to cover those as well. But before we get all the way into that and talking about the argument, I want to start with what I think is at a very important point going forward, which is the issue of scientism in the modern culture. And basically what scientism is the idea that either science is the best way to understand the world or the only way to understand the world. I've noticed as time has gone on, it does seem like the younger the generation, the more hardcore they get with scientism, which is to say the more they lean towards it's the only way to understand truth. And you get this with people who will deny that there's any way to really even understand history in a way. In a way, like I remember watching a video, and to be fair, this is sort of an extreme version of it, where someone effectively said they wouldn't believe anything that was pre the internet. Effectively, like before you could take photos or videos of it, it's like, oh well, we can't know anything about that. And so that's kind of an extreme view of it. But in less extreme views, you'll have people who will say, oh, well, what's your scientific proof for God? Oh, well, I've never found any science that proves God exists or miracles happen or whatnot. And again, you can push back, especially on the miracle stuff, but there is this very high view of it. And there's a couple issues with it. One is that it's self-defeating. It's self-defeating because science has to presuppose some philosophical ideas in order for you to then do science. So, for example, some of these are, you have to presuppose that the world isn't just in your mind, that everything outside of you is just complete imaginary, and that your mind is just being stimulated into thinking that things are actually happening. You also have to believe that the laws of physics aren't just constantly changing, you don't know about it. You have to presuppose that you didn't just come into existence 3 seconds ago thinking that it was X amount of time. So you have all these like presuppositions that you have to take into account. And so in order to say that, oh, well, scientism is the only way to know things, you can't then presuppose it, because then you would need science in order to prove that science is the only way to know things, in which case you're now just talking in a circle. And the reason why I think this is important is because you'll talk to some people and you'll be like, oh, well, here's a philosophical proof or a philosophical argument for something. And they'll be like, oh, well, that's for, a bunch of nonsense. That's just a bunch of people who, couldn't get hired into anything useful and blah, blah, blah. And I really want to deal with this first because you'll find that, again, this is pretty prevalent in the culture. And so going from there, I want to also talk about two different types of arguments. Now, one type is what's called a deductive argument. And basically what this says is if the premises are true, then logically the conclusion must follow. So this is, you could say, it's sort of like a hard argument, if that makes sense. So basically, you argue, in this case, you'll be arguing more on the premises and if the logical steps being followed are actually right. Whereas something like an inductive argument could be, quote unquote, a non-hard argument, in that it's more intuition based. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all just feelings and whatnot, but it does mean that the conclusion is more likely to be true rather than necessarily true. Does that kind of make sense to people?
It does, but I think we're having some slide issues here.
Oops.
Am I the only one that is stuck on?
It's capturing the presentation window, but not the slides.
Why Discord?
Yeah.
Shame.
I don't know, maybe try sharing your screen instead, or the other way around.
Yeah. Let me try that. Screens. There we go. How about now?
Yep, it's showing up. So
yay!
Cool.
Okay. So, getting back to what I was saying before, do people understand the difference between deductive and inductive? Or is there still some confusion on what the separation is?
Yeah.
Okay. So, deductive reasoning sounds like unsurprisingly like magical theory. I don't quite understand what you mean by magical theory, so you'll have to clarify that. But
did you say that deductive argument starts at the premise and moves towards the conclusion, and inductive argument starts the other direction? Or would that not be necessarily fair?
I think, at least how I understand it, is deductive is more, I guess, like binary, and like it's either true or it's false, whether or not the premises are true and whether the conclusion is true or false. The inductive is a little bit more, I think, not quite vague, but it's more based on what is more probable. So the inductive argument is true if the conclusion is more likely than its opposite. Whereas with a deductive argument, if the argument is logically sound and valid, you have to accept the conclusion. So I think that's sort of how I understand the difference.
So the deductive one, Zelda, is, I think you're actually misunderstanding a little bit. All a deductive one is saying is sort of as Tito said, which is that it's very binary. So deductive arguments are ones that you usually see like what's called a logical syllogism for, and basically, so you have like a list of premises, and I'll show this actually. Let's start with this because this one might make it a little bit more clear. So this is the Kalam cosmological argument as this is supposed to be Kalam cosmological, whatever.
What a
So
chance to miss the spaceship meme, the spaceman meme.
that's true.
You gotta redo the slide.
I'll have to try to see if I can fit it in, because I still have to add to this. So maybe I can fit it in later. But in this case, so the reason why this is sort of a deductive argument is so you have your two premises, right? Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. So the reason why this is deductive is that in order for the conclusion to not be true, either premise one or premise two has to be not true, or the conclusion has to commit a logical fallacy. Does that sort of make a little bit more sense, Zelda? And when I deal the teleological argument or the fine-tuning argument, I'll explain why that's more inductive rather than deductive. There's a good amount of resources you can find on the internet explaining them. If you're ever looking for like a really good solid definition for something, I would always prioritize universities or philosophical journals, because sometimes you'll get these answers on definitions for terms, but they're not coming from people who actually deal with this stuff, and so they're very vague or they're kind of misleading. Oh man, what's the college? There is a college website actually that does deal with, if I remember it, I'll post it later, that I'll actually give definitions for this stuff. That's pretty helpful.
Are you thinking of Stanford?
Yes. Yeah, Stanford I think has
dictionary.
one. Yeah.
They have a great philosophy stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is Stanford. So, this is the argument in totality. It's very simple, but in a weird way, because it's simple, some people tend to brush it off sometimes. But I think the thing that really adds strength to it is when you actually get into the premises and defending them, and then I think that really highlights the strength of the argument. Now, I do want to note one thing, because this will actually deal with the most common objection, is the word begins here. If something doesn't begin to exist, then it doesn't need a cause for its existence. Like, let's imagine, for example, the universe is past eternal, so it's always existed. Then you would not have to explain why the universe came into existence, because it's always been there. So that's why counters like, oh, well, if everything needs a cause for its existence, then does God, like, what caused God? And, they try to go through this infinite regress of, oh, then this God caused that God, and blah, 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 blah. But that's actually not what the argument is saying. It's only things that begin to exist that must have a cause for its existence. Now, so there's some evidence for premise one. One of these is just experience. Things do not just come into existence. Like, you don't have rabbits just randomly appearing out of the ether. You don't have, I think William and Craig and I are talking to someone. He's like, I don't think you've ever worried about an elephant spontaneously appearing in your living room. And I think that's pretty compelling argument. There's not usually a lot of debate on the first premise. Some will try to appeal to quantum mechanics, but that is because they is because of a misunderstanding in quantum mechanics, in which they think that particles of matter are actually just being created and not created. And that's not a good understanding of it. Quantum mechanics has to deal far more with the position of particles, not them spontaneously coming into existence. Now, there is a part of quantum mechanics where things can seemingly move faster than light, and I think I'm going to try to get into that next week, but it'll depend on how complicated the material is and whether or not I think I can actually properly synthesize it. Now, another thing to argue for the first premise is to give a parity argument, which is if this universe, how can this universe just come into existence? And why do we then just limit it to the universe? Like, let's say you're like, oh, well, no, maybe the universe did just come into existence. And I'm like, okay, but why are we limiting it at the universe? Because the universe includes things like space, time, energy, matter, elementary particles, all these things. And so to say, well, everything in it had come into existence, but specific things in it couldn't have, or just don't, I think shows how the argument doesn't seem to really hold much water. And I'm not quite sure how you could even prove that it would make sense for the universe just to come to existence, but not individual things in it. Now, there are some people who try to do this based on what they try to argue is that it's actually a composition fallacy, which is like the first major rebuttal to the first premise, and actually probably the only one I've really heard. And to explain what a composition fallacy is a composition fallacy is, and it's easier to explain with an example. So let's say you had an elephant. Actually, let's take a house, so it's a little less graphic. And you disassembled the house into a bunch of bricks. You just had a brick house, and now it's disassembled to a pile of bricks. And you pick up a brick, and you're like, you know what? This brick is very light. Therefore, the house must, since the house is made of brick, therefore the house is, must also be light because its individual brick is light. Another example is like an elephant. Oh, well, if this element was in a bunch of pieces and then you picked up an individual piece and you're like, oh, well, this is light, therefore the elephant must be light, is a sign of what's called, again, the composition fallacy. Now, the reason why I don't think this holds much weight is because the fallacy makes sense in terms of physical laws. So again, it makes sense in terms of gravity, in terms of weight, and stuff like that, but it doesn't really make sense in terms of what's referred to as a metaphysical law, which is, as the example I gave earlier, things don't just spontaneously come into existence. Logical laws actually have to be followed and stuff like that. And so I do think it's a category mistake. And also, I think the burden of proof is on the person arguing why the universe can spontaneously come into existence, seemingly from nothing, but things in the universe just can't. Again, to me, stuff like that, they need to hold their weight and actually prove it rather than sort of just saying it, which is often how it goes. Now, does everyone understand the fallacy and the issues related to it?
Makes sense.
I'm gonna you still got something?
So, let's see. No, I think this makes sense. But you're saying that this isn't a good example or a good argument against because it doesn't take into account things like math or other metaphysical things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
Basically. It's as I would say is a category mistake. Again, composition fallacy makes perfect sense when you're talking about physical objects, but it seems very bizarre to me to then say, oh, well, it actually also applies to the laws of causation. Again, the universe can come into existence, but nothing inside of it can. To me, that seems very ad hoc because it's like, oh, well, or even like almost a no true Scotsman fallacy where you're like, well, not true Scotsman, it would be a special pleading. Or basically like, sure, this law makes complete sense of everything except the one thing I don't want it to, because it may lead to theological conclusions I don't agree with. And so that's why I don't think the fallacy really makes much sense. And again, most people really don't argue about the first premise. I've only seen it one time on Capturing Christianity. There's a chat between William Lane Craig and one of the guys, I believe from the Atheist Experience. Wouldn't recommend the Atheist Experience, mainly because it's like the worst version of atheist arguments I've ever heard. But this guy was at least pretty sophisticated himself, and he sort of tried to argue for it, but I really think it really feels like special pleading. Because again, you're like, oh, this thing makes complete sense in all scenarios except this one. And I just don't know how you could argue with it either, or argue for it, I should say. Now, what is far more controversial is the second premise. Evidence for the second premise. So the second premise, if you'll recall, is that the universe began to exist. Now, this one is definitely the more contested premise, and it's why next week I'm going to be dealing with solely counters to it. Right now I'm going to deal with the positive case for it, and then next week I'll deal with the counter case for it, because there's so many things to try to given for it. But that being said, I actually don't think the counters for it are very good, and I want to do a little bit of callback when I was talking about scientism, because oftentimes you'll see people who try to argue against the second premise, and they'll try to cite scientific models. Now I'm going to deal with this a little later on, but sort of explain, when people talk about scientific models, you're basically talking about frameworks that someone will make up a framework and say the math seems to work for this. It works with what we know of the universe, and it doesn't seem to violate these laws. And it'll come with its own list of assumptions, basically. There's like a billion models out there. Just because someone say, oh, well, scientists have made a model for X, Y, and Z, that shouldn't be viewed as like, oh my goodness, it's like earth-shaking revelation or something. It's really not. All it means is they managed to not violate math. And obviously there is a little bit more to it, but you shouldn't just I wouldn't freak out about it. And also it's why I think that dealing with the philosophical argument is very good, because it helps you not have to deal with and memorize a billion models out there that all contradict each other and usually rarely have any evidence supporting them. And I'll try to deal with some of the more common ones, because there's some that I've heard cited again and again and again, and I think they're important to deal with. But that is why the reason I'm trying to focus on the philosophical stuff is because it's a lot simpler in the grand scheme of things, and I think is actually can be more compelling sometimes than the quote-unquote science, because oftentimes the science isn't really that settled. It's very much people just throwing stuff at the wall hoping one of it might work. So, dealing with that, I need to deal with infinity. And basically the impossibility of infinity. Now, the reason why you have to deal with this is because if you can just say, oh, well, the universe is just past eternal, then it doesn't need a reason for why it came into existence. And so then the question becomes, well, can you actually have a past eternity? And to explain, now to get into this, when I'm going to be talking about time from this point, what I mean is quote unquote events. And basically what an event would be is like a slight change. Any form of change, I will classify as an event, and therefore a moment in time, just to make things a little bit simpler. Now, the question then becomes, can you have an infinite number of these quote unquote events? And I'm going to argue you actually can't, and you can't actually have an actual infinity of anything. Notice what I'm saying. Thing. That's important to remember. Now, to highlight the reason why you can't is because you have what are called paradoxes. And basically, kind of what a paradox is a thought experiment you run in which, in some way, it contradicts reality or contradicts logic. That's kind of what a paradox is in a very layman view of it. What do you want to know about time, Zelda? And I hope it's not relativity, because then this really will get much longer. Saying isn't time infinite? No, it's not. So time is not infinite, but it is approaching infinity. And to explain the difference is, let's start at event 0 in time, and we keep adding one moment in time, and we keep doing that. Now, as you keep adding those moments in time, you're going to be getting closer and closer to infinity, but you're not actually going to reach it. So, for example, let's say we're all in heaven, right? And it talks about how we're there for eternity. We're not literally going to reach infinity and be like, okay, guys, ready for infinity plus 1 day? Like, we're not going to start marking on our calendars infinity 2, because we just we reached eternity 2. But you just keep adding 1 to it. And so to explain that, let's talk about the past. Let's say, and this is an example given to show the impossibility of infinities in reality. And one of them is Herbert's Hotel. Now, what Herbert's Hotel is let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. Now, in this infinite number of rooms, let's say you have an infinite amount of guests and they fill up each room. Now, let's say I then have the first guest move to the second guest, and then have the second guest move to the third guest, fourth to the fifth, fifth to the sixth, this goes on for infinity. I then fit in another person into the first spot, and then I have that person go to the second spot, then to the third spot. And I just keep going this for infinity. Although the hotel was originally full with an infinite amount of people, and now that I've added in another infinite amount of people into it, the total number of people in the hotel has not changed. Or I could give another example. So let's say, we have everyone settled, everyone's in their room. I then say half the people in the room just poof, they just disappear. I don't know. I Thanos snap my fingers, and I have the Infinity Gauntlet, snap my fingers, boom, half the hotel's guests evaporate. Technically, no one. There's still the same amount of people in there as it was previously. And you can sort of keep going like this. So I could have, let's say, an infinite amount of people leave the rooms. But even as they're leaving, there's still an infinite amount of people in the room because they couldn't possibly leave. And what this is basically is sort of to show is there's a lot of stuff you can do with infinities in math. So, for example, you can add to infinity in math. You can actually add infinities. Like there's different types of infinity that you can add in math. And although you can do these things mathematically, when you start applying the reasoning to the world, you start to realize that a lot of this stuff doesn't actually there seems to be a disconnect between what we can mathematically do and what actually works. Yes, there are different types of infinity. I honestly can't remember them off the top of my head, but a book that I won't recommend because it's super deep. I mean, I guess if you're up to it, you could. It's called the Blackwell's Companion Guide to Natural Theology. It is mind-melting in terms of difficulty, which is why I said I probably wouldn't recommend it to start off with. I'd probably just look up a YouTube video on what different infinities are. But it talks about that in the Kalam Cosmological section, that chapter. They talk about it. And actually, I think a much easier to read book, though not by a ton, is the Kalam Cosmological Argument by William Lane Craig, and that one also covers different types of infinity and basically what set number theory is. It's actually pretty interesting, at least for me, because I kind of like math, but it gets fairly complicated. And this is, again, just an illustration in order to hopefully show why an actual infinity in reality doesn't make sense. Another analogy I've heard that kind of explain the issue as well is, let's imagine, so you have the sun and then you have 2 planets. Now, planet 1 rotates, let's say, once per year. The second planet rotates 2 times per year. Now, let's say an infinite amount of time goes by. Even though an infinite amount of time has gone by, and you were asked, hey, which planet rotated more? Actually, both planets would have rotated the exact same amount of time, which is that they both would have rotated around the sun an infinite amount of times. So all this to say is that just because you can do something mathematically doesn't mean you can necessarily apply it to reality. Actually, I think another good example of this is, I think it was Stephen Hawking. He wrote about time. I forget the book name, which I shouldn't because it was such a famous book. Yeah, Tios, that is some of the different infinities. So like you have I think it's natural numbers. So you have like a natural number set, or integers. You have an infinite amount of integers, an infinite amount of decimals, and stuff like that. Those are types of infinity, but I think there are more. I would have to refresh my knowledge on set theory in order to remember the names of them, because they do have different corresponding names.
Yeah, the cardinal value, which is like the type of infinity, is they use the Hebrew aleph. So you have aleph null, aleph 1, aleph 2, and those are like different types of, and yeah, it gets crazy.
Yeah, and again, the whole point of this is basically just to illustrate why you can't actually have an infinite amount of time. And what it basically means is, therefore, you can't have a past eternal universe because the idea itself is impossible. Are there any questions? Because I can understand how this can be fairly difficult to wrap your head around the first time. Does it make sense to everyone? And don't feel bad if it doesn't make sense the first time, because it's, again, I had to reread the book a couple times because my mind was actually like melting trying to understand it. Okay, so now the other part, and this gets into what I mean by math versus reality. Now, math explains reality very great in a very nice way, and actually there is an argument about for God based on math. I'm not going to get into it because I'm not sure about how great the argument is, and I haven't read much on it. But there is one out there if you want to look it up. Redeem Zoomer talked about it in a video. He talked about the beauty of math and the argument from it. But that's obviously not what we're covering today. And so, again, talking about, as I said earlier, in math, you can add to infinity. So you can do like infinity plus 1, which just equals infinity, or infinity plus 2, which equals infinity. Insert whatever number you want, add it equals infinity. Now, what some try to say is, well, maybe if you add events, one by one by one, you keep adding these events, you actually then get an infinite amount. So to sort of give the strongest example they give is, let's say you have a number line from 0 to 1, and you then put a line in the middle. So you divide it in half. You then go to the first half and the second half, and you put a line down there, so you split it into quarters. And then you split it into eighths, and you split it into 16ths, and 32nds, and 64s, and 128ths, and you just keep going. You keep dividing it. You keep subdividing it, and saying. And what they say is, well, you can actually have an infinite amount of points on that line. There's an infinite amount of points, and you could say, well, see, this is how you can actually have an infinite amount of events while still having a point 0 and a current point. Now, I don't think this works. And I don't think it works because you can also do this with 0 and 2, 0 and 3, 0 and 4. And you can do it for any line segment you want. And you can divide it up and create an actual infinite amount of points on it. But then you run into the question of, well, if there's an infinite amount of points between 0 and 1 and 0 and 2, and we can't traverse an infinite amount of events because it would still be, as we're traversing these events, there would always be more events ahead of us to get to the current point. Then how did we actually get to the current moment in time? There should have been an infinite amount of events before we got here that would have then stopped us from being able to get to here. Does that make sense? Because I understand I said a decent amount of stuff pretty quickly. Okay.
I'm late to the conversation, but
yeah, don't worry. I'll be recording it, so you'll be able to listen to the earlier part.
Yeah, no, that's cool. You haven't come across the theoretical probability in relation to those infinite points, have you?
I probably have, but could you refresh my memory on it?
Oh, I'm just you were saying that there's these infinite amount of points in between 0 and 1, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that they actually have to have occurred, but the theoretically, or the theoretical possibility or probability of those events happening. How did we get to this point in time? I'm just trying to get my head around where you.
Okay, so
how are you going to tie? How are you going to tie the concept of infinity to where we are and this point in time and space?
Okay, yeah. So I think what I'd say to that, if someone would say, "Well, you don't actually have to actualize all those points," is that actually doesn't make sense. So I'm not sure if you came in late, but I said for right now when I'm talking about time, I'm talking about events, and by events I mean a change. No matter how slight it is, that infinitesimally small change would then count as an individual event. And so I would say it probably doesn't. I would want to look more into it in order to give a more concrete answer. But just hearing what you've said, it would seem I don't see how you could probabilistically skip events in time. That doesn't make any sense to me. Because it would seem that events would necessarily have to follow one another. Like you couldn't just skip a quote unquote chunk of that infinity. And plus, another issue I could see is how. Okay, so let's say you're trying to skip parts of this in this. So you have this line, and you have all these infinite points, and you're trying to skip these points. How can you, even if you let's say you skipped 1,000,000,000 of these points, there would still be an infinite amount of points remaining. Infinite points between them. So technically no, Zelda, because a point is not really a space, and this gets a little bit more. How would I describe it? It gets a little confusing because when we think of points, I am admittedly using an analogy of an actual number line that you could theoretically see. Isn't a space though? It's a change. Isn't a space though a change? So when we think of points on a number line, we think of like the space a point occupies, but that's not really what is meant by a point, because a point itself would be approaching an infinitely small amount of space, and so mathematically it would just become it wouldn't take up any space at all. Though you are kind of right in the sense that even if we, as I was saying before, like subdividing it, you could then keep subdividing it further and further, and even when you'd eventually reach this infinite amount of points, you could keep adding points to it. So actually, I guess in a way, yeah, you're right. You could have an infinite amount of points in between points, but I think mathematicians usually dissuade that by basically using an axiom, which is sort of like a presupposition, and saying that the points don't take up any space. And they're like, and then this is, again, it works mathematically, but you can't really put it in the real world because things take up space. Like you could never get to a point where you shrunk the distance between things that you could actually get a real point in reality. So it's more theoretical than actual. But again, to get back to your question, Stringer, yeah, I just don't see how that would work with time or events. But again, I'd want to look more into it before I so that way I could give a better response to it. Actually, if you want to just DM it to me, and so then I can try to look it up and see if I can figure it out, and maybe deal with it next week. But
yeah, it was more just the practical application of infinity. I got, as I said, I did come in late, so I haven't heard the beginning. So
yeah, basically what I've just yeah,
keep going, bro. Just keep going. push through it. I'll be here forever, and I'll muddle myself along.
Yeah, so basically just to this point, I've been basically making the case that although infinities work in math, and that there's ways in which you can use it to try to solve problems, they don't actually exist in the real world. And so what I'm kind of pushing against is the idea that just because something works mathematically, therefore it must have a correspondence to reality.
Okay, yeah. I'm with it. Yeah.
And so I gave so that's why I'm saying, like, sure, again, you have all these infinities in math, and they actually work great. I mean, I'm an engineer, so I deal with things approaching infinity all the time, because that's what you have to do with derivatives and integrals in order to figure out very complicated mathematical problems, like figuring out the areas of complex shapes, figuring out how different physical phenomena work with objects. So I understand that, and again, it works really good, and it does have a correspondence in that you can use it to very accurately guess things that will then happen in the real world. But it's important to remember that just because you can do something mathematically doesn't therefore means it equals reality. Because another counter to this would be a lot of math is reliant on certain axioms that then have to be argued and agreed with. So, for example, in the book I was talking about earlier, the Blackwell's Companion Guide to Natural Theology, as well as the Kalam Cosmological Argument by William Lane Craig, he talks about how there was actually a debate going on, I think it was the 1800s, actually it might have been earlier, I forget exactly when, over which axioms mathematicians were going to use when talking about infinity. And again, axioms are basically presuppositions. They're basically things that you're like, this is just true, and that's it. Like, it's basically not something you can really prove. It's just something that you all agree to in order to then do stuff. And I think it really highlights that just because you can do something mathematically doesn't equal reality. There's like 1,000 mathematical models for how the universe could have come into existence. They all contradict each other. Therefore, they all can't be true. And so just because they all seem to work with the math doesn't mean that they are true. Because if that was the case, then you would have a bunch of conflicting claims about what happened in the past. So, not to stick on this for too much longer, but does anyone have any sort of like last questions before I move on? And again, if you want to DM me and like, hey man, I don't get this at all, I can. I think I have a. Trying to think if there's another good resource. I can try to help you find resources that will help explain some of the stuff in a different way that maybe can help. Like William Lane Craig, I know, has an entire series that are almost like 5 to 10 minute short videos that basically talk about the stuff. And those might help because he gives pretty good illustrations. So again, any last questions before I move on? Okay, let's move on to the next one. So now the slightly more controversial in Christian circles is the Big Bang. Now, the Big Bang can be used as a form of scientific argument for the second premise that the universe began to exist. And to basically summarize the Big Bang, we were looking out into space and we started noticing that the light coming in from all around us was slightly shifted. Now, to kind of explain it, light can act like a wave. And so as light sources are moving away from each other, they'll actually can shift in the light spectrum because color is determined by the waves, the amount of waves and the amplitude. And so as you're stretching it out, so let's say you're flattening the troughs and I think it's the hill, I forget, or the mountain, whatever you want to call it, the up part versus the highest point and the lowest point of the wave. As you stretch it out, those then shrink, and that actually gets you a different color. And specifically, it gets you red in this case. And so this slight red shift then led scientists to be like, okay, well, if everything's moving away from us, then if we started going backwards in time, everything would be moving closer. And eventually, as you do that, to a certain point, you'd reach what would we call the singularity. And so basically, you'd reach a point where you couldn't shrink anymore because you just reached a point. And you do this by using things like approaching infinity and stuff like that. And what this basically means is that as you reach the singularity, things like space, time, matter, all this stuff basically approach zero. And as they approach zero, you then have a weird issue of, okay, so now that everything is just zero, how did we get this stuff? Like, where did this stuff come from? And this actually led to an interesting result in the scientific community because some sort of, in a weird way, seeing the theological implications of it, actually then tried to counter it. I forget the name, but one of the first scientists to research the Big Bang became a staunch advocate against it, specifically because he thought of the theological implications, which is kind of ironic considering how and I'm sure many of us grew up, and how, at least in American Christian circles, evangelical circles, they tend to be a very negative stigmatizing of it. But I do think it's kind of misguided because I think that actually the Big Bang makes a lot of sense from a Christian perspective because we do believe that there was once nothing and then God just, boom, flick of the fingers and just boom, everything coming into existence. Now, of course, again, this isn't to get into arguments about, old Earth versus young Earth and all that stuff. But it is to say, hey, here is a scientific proof you can try to use that a lot of atheists and agnostics are going to agree to. And so why not try to use it in order to leverage it? Now, obviously, if you personally think that it's bunk, then I'm not going to encourage you to try to make a argument that on something that you feel is nonsense, because that'd be pretty unethical. So before I get onto the second scientific argument, and actually where we'll close out, does anyone have any questions? Yes, Elder. So actually, there's a book called, I think it's 7 Days to Divide the World by, 7 Days That Divide the World by John Lennox. and I believe his view on the matter. So there's, I believe, 7 current major views on Genesis 1 through 11, and his view on the 6 days is that each day is meant to be corresponds to a age. So like, first day at this age, this stuff was happening, and then another age of time, and the amount of time between them is indeterminate, but they're longer than like the what you would normally think of as like 24 hours. So he basically like the beginning of the universe versus the beginning of the Earth, because there is a separation, I believe, in day 1 and 2. He basically like those are separate, indeterminate amount of times, or at least indeterminate in the sense that the Bible doesn't tell us. And that is one of the going theories on Genesis. Again, William Lane Craig talks about this in Defenders 3, his Defenders 3 series called I think an Excursion in Genesis or something like that. And he talks about the 7 different models that currently exist on explaining Genesis. But again, I'm not going to get into arguments about that because all those ones, although are interesting, I think are the point of apologetics is not to argue necessarily for specific Christian doctrine as much as arguing what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. So basically arguing on the things that separate someone from a Christian versus someone not a Christian, instead of trying to get into the nitty gritty of different what Mike Winger would call in-house debates. So stuff like Genesis, Revelation. Oh, how do you understand end time stuff? Trying to think of other ones. Again, Genesis 1, or like how do you understand the age of the patriarchs and how that works and stuff like that. But anyways, before I go into the second scientific argument for the second premise, does anyone have any questions?
Oh, I want to throw so many objections up, but I won't. I think in regards to ages, yada yada yada, that those arguments that can be presented, there's always the aspect of I don't know from an apologetics point of view, where you can say, "Oh, look, I don't know." In some of it, though, there is standing up for who God is in His nature and what is plainly written. For example, in theological. In theology, there's the law of first mention. The first time something's mentioned within Scripture is basically gives an understanding of what that is. So in the days, have a morning and an evening. That is the first day. So therefore, it describes what a day is going forward. And when people use a long argument, just in that example, it casts doubt upon what God has said and what God has done and what God has revealed about who He is, which is, for me, that's anything that dishonors God or casts doubt upon God needs to be looked at very carefully. There's concepts that can be applied to it. You can say this, that, everything else, all for the desire of explaining away something that's brought about, say, by science or mathematics, whatever. And yet God, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever, Alpha and Omega, declaring the end from the beginning. They all point to the nature and the character of God revealed to us that we might know Him. So in apologetics for myself, if something impugns upon the honor and the knowledge of who God is, that's where I tend to argue about that. Bring God into the equation. Well, here's, the uncreated one. When people bring something, do you believe in the Big Bang? I don't know. I know. I mean, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's no time within the Hebrew that's referenced that. That could be a very short period of time, or it could be a very long period of time, just in that one verse, and leading into the second, and the earth was void and without form, darkness on the face of the deep. So that would be the only point that I would bring up when discussing with people stuff that is revealed about God, and that helps us understand the rest of the Scripture when people try and shift that, they're actually starting to cast doubt upon what God has actually said. You know, did he mean a day, or did he mean like, you know, a billion years? You know, and in reality, I don't know, but I just take it plainly for what it says. It says evening and morning. It doesn't say evenings and morning and mornings, but it speaks in the singular event. Therefore, for me, you know, one day is one day. A day is a day. Otherwise, it casts doubt on everything else. That's the only point that I could bring up with that.
Yeah, well, I would say again, don't never use an argument that you don't think is right. Like, I'm not suggesting you be like, oh, well, you know, they believe it, so therefore I'll argue for something that I don't think is right, because obviously that's fairly unethical, and I think would end up just harming you in the end, because it shows an inauthenticity to your argument. It shows that it's not really in good faith. And I think that's probably what I'm going to stick to for now, because again, I don't want to get into a whole argument over Genesis. There's a lot of stuff out there that's already talked about it. A lot of people have already argued about it. But that's kind of not really the point of the class, and I don't want it to devolve into that. So yeah, I would say, like, if you don't think it's like, hey, I'm not sure about this, I don't think this would work, then don't feel bad about not using it. Like, I'm not God, I am not the gospel, I am not perfect. And if you like, hey, I don't think this works, totally fine. And actually, you probably will like my second scientific proof then, because the second scientific proof is based on the concept of entropy. Now, the definition for entropy in the non-mathematical sense, because there is a mathematical definition for entropy that you use in things like thermodynamics and chemistry. The non-mathematical definition is entropy is a quote-unquote measure of, quote, disorder of a system, or the energy unavailable to do work. In a sort of simplify this, I think the picture is probably the best explanation. And basically what this is showing, so delta S is entropy. And so basically what it's showing is that the state of entropy is increasing as you go towards these gases, and then likewise it's decreasing in the opposite direction. And basically entropy favors going in this direction. Now, or I'm sorry, in the other direction. So entropy as a whole is actually a if I could speak, a decreasing quality, or not quality, quantity, a decreasing quantity. So over time, entropy of the universe is actually decreasing, and this is actually what leads to things like the cold heat death of the universe, where basically atoms are so evenly distributed that there's no more movement or interaction. So this is actually one of the scientifically theorized versions of the end of the universe, which is that, you know, at some point in the future we'd reach this point where absolutely nothing would happen. Energy would be perfectly distributed amongst space. And the interesting thing about it is that if you work it into reverse, right? So you think, oh, well, okay, so if the entropy overall system is decreasing, what about when it's increasing? Well, as you increase it, you have to reach a point where you can't go beyond it. And you have this other issue of, okay, if entropy is decreasing, if an infinite amount of time has gone by, then we should have reached zero. Like, we should have reached that perfect of energy being perfectly distributed, atoms being perfectly distributed. We should have reached that an infinite amount of time ago. And so in order to explain away this, you have to come up with some kind of mechanism that reverses entropy. And so far, said mechanism doesn't seem to exist. Now, some may argue, oh, well, you're committing a God of the gaps fallacy, where you're saying, well, entropy, you know, we can't seem to figure out a way for it to be reversed, therefore God. But that is abusing the God of the gaps fallacy, because the God of the gaps fallacy is based on ignorance, not on what we know. So what we know is that entropy is decreasing, and we know that if an infinite amount of time went by, it would eventually just hit zero. We do know that. That's not up for debate. That's why models have been made to try to figure out how can we actually reverse it. And so far, I'm not aware of any that have actually successfully done it. I am aware of one model proposed by, I believe it was Stephen Hawking, and basically, it wasn't Stephen Hawking, sorry, it was the guy who worked with him, Roger Penrose. And what Roger Penrose said is, doing a bunch of math stuff, eventually you'd reach a point where time would flip and start going in the reverse direction. And if time is going in the reverse direction, and this would be at some point in the future, then entropy itself would start to increase again. And as it's increasing again, you would then not run into the issue of it being perfectly distributed and the universe basically ceasing to exist. But of course, the question then becomes, okay, so what does you mean by time going in reverse? And William Lane Craig deals with this. He actually talked with Roger Penrose on the Unbelievable podcast, if you want to look that up. And I think he shows pretty clearly that it doesn't, it's one of those things where, again, it works mathematically, but actually doesn't make any sense when you try to correspond it with reality. So this argument for it from a scientific point of view, actually you could use Stringer because it doesn't matter about how much time has passed. And so you could use this, whereas like before, if you have issues with the Big Bang Theory, you don't have to use that. But does everyone understand this? Okay, so I think that's going to conclude this class. So these are all I shouldn't say all. These are at least some of the positive cases for it. If you want more material on the matter, you can look up, again, William Lane Craig's book, the Kalam Cosmological Argument. You could also look up the Black Whale's Companion Guide to Natural Theology. I would only warn you that both are extremely complicated. If you want a more simpler book, On Guard by William Lane Craig has a chapter talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument and actually going into this. Frank Turek has a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and he actually covers this material as well. I believe he has an acronym called SURGE, where he basically covers he breaks down the different cases for the beginning of the universe. I'm trying to think if anyone else has made material. I know Gavin Orland from Truth Unites is going to be making a video soon on the matter, and a YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy has also done a video on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. That's very good as well. And I can, if you want access to these resources, just DM me and then I'll find them and send them to you, because that'll probably be easier. The easiest way to do it. But besides that, next week we're going to be covering the objections to the second premise and whether or not they actually hold water. So thank you guys for coming. I am going to release the the audio once I have time to actually edit it and make sure that it's decent. So if there are any last questions, let me know now before I close us out. Oh, it doesn't seem like there's any questions. So again, thank you guys all for coming. We'll start the next class same time, same day. Though if anyone's like, hey, I prefer if it's this day, just let me know, and then I can see if I can work things out. But otherwise, have a great day/night, depending on where you guys are at.